Thank you very much for this presentation. And صباح الخير تاني. So let's go there to you, Marion. No?
Yeah.
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 So Marion Dixon, so please introduce yourself, and then 15 minutes, please, no more. Oh, sorry.
Okay. Thank you very much for coming to our panel. I'm very glad to be here. And I thank Martha and Karim for inviting me. It feels like I've been working on research in and about the region on agriculture and food for many years, and I have been kind of seeking a research group like this, so I'm very pleased with it. And I want to propose a methodology that comes out of my, you know what, actually I need a little bit of light to see my notes. A methodology that that comes out of research, field research that I conducted in Egypt from 2008 to 2012, based on my doctoral dissertation on what is titled "The Making of the Corporate Agri-Food System in Egypt." And I want to start off the main analytical framework is capital accumulation and the state system, and a problematic that I want to propose. The problematic for this research group, I looked on the website, and is looking at problems in food production that reflect policy, in particular the de-development of Arab economies, which the presentations yesterday eloquently and devastatingly reflected. So that's clearly one trend in the region. And the problematic that I want to present is another trend, overlapping trend, which is, we can just say very simply, problems in rural livelihoods or access to adequate nutritious food that is a reflection of who controls what and who gets to eat what. And in particular, I'm talking about capital concentration in land, markets, and the like. So the main intervention here is an analytic of a national or domestic agri-food industry in Egypt. And for this presentation paper, I'm just talking about this. The industry in Egypt is has a very long history. I'm just going to talk about the industry as it grew from the early 1990s to the revolution, 2011. The reason is that it went through an explosion, a tremendous growth in consolidation during that period, just as Egypt was more greatly integrated or incorporated or participated in, if you want to call it the world economy, free trade regime, globalization, whatever you want to call it. So what is the agri-food industry? I know I have to go fast. So essentially, it's the integrated, corporatized agriculture and food sector, or we can just say the formal sector that is one part of a larger formal economy. It's dominated by Egyptian family business groups, transnational corporations, multinational corporations, financial firms, and the military also. I'm not including the military. Of course, the military is a big player in agriculture and food. The share of food that the industry distributes as a percentage of the national food market is relatively small, and I'm going to show some figures, but grew rapidly leading up to the uprising. And importantly for this group, there are multiple and overlapping direct and indirect consequences of this growth for small-scale producers and vendors, and I'm only going to address a couple of them. Okay. So the landscape, there are four, one way to think about it is there are four main intersecting nodes of the industry: fresh fruits and vegetables and processing, and part of that is, a big part of those two nodes is the agro-export market, which is Roland, the presenter, was talking about in Lebanon. In Egypt, that's a big part of the agro-export market, some for the domestic market, but mostly for the supermarket and hypermarket shelves of the Middle East and Europe. Animal protein complex, largely for the domestic market, and then what you can call corporate food service and food retail. Food service being McDonald's and the like, I'm just giving examples, food retail, supermarkets and hypermarkets. So clearly this formal economy, it has a wide consumer spectrum. It cuts across class, but is dominated by, the consumer market is dominated by the middle upper classes. Okay, so this is just a snapshot of what are we talking about? Proportions of the industry, how much food is being captured by these corporate bodies in this time period. So 2005 estimate, very quickly, okay, where am I? Sorry here. Okay, quick estimate, 70% of processed food production and comes from the informal or non-organized and independent enterprises. That was the estimate in 2005. And 80% of employment. 2007 estimate, about 70% of food sales were from the informal sector, about 90 to 95% of the food outlets are small grocery stores. In terms of concentration, tremendous concentration. If we just look at the agro-export market, in 2010, the top 6.5% of exporting companies made up 41% of the total value of agricultural exports. And by 2004, these are the top agro-exporters. I'm not going to go over them because I don't have time. So this growth and consolidation really happened on the back of two economic crises. Since the early 1990s, as we all know, 1991, this was actually an economic crisis that was rattling much of the indebted South, including Egypt, and structural adjustment packages were passed as a way to resolve this crisis. And that led to there were two major trends, and I want to quickly go through this. Two major trends. The first trend, corporatization, meaning transnational corporations, in many cases, re-entered the country, were part of buying up the state assets that were being privatized, and Egyptian family business groups began to corporatize and integrate into and within agriculture and food. That's why I call this the wave of corporatization. Of course, this was also the time that Egypt then joined the World Trade Organization. Then there was a watershed moment, 2003, major moment of financialization and new banking law in Egypt that led to rapid expansion of financial firms that were very active in mergers and acquisitions in the agri-food sector. And of course, this was the rise of a new reemergence of a political class of finance capitalists in Egypt. So during this rapid growth and consolidation, there was nearly five-fold increase in investments in the food industry. If looking at the estimated share of value distributed, for example, the growth of corporate food share looks even more significant. And an example here is hypermarket sales as a percentage of total grocery sales rose from 13% to 26% from 2003 to 2011. So as the industry has grown, the direct consumer market for small-scale producers and vendors has shrunk. And an explanation in interviews with food processors and the like often explain this exclusion of smallholders in part because of the requirements of certifications. For example, one executive said, well, the market is now one of higher food safety standards, and this is putting restrictions on how food is produced. Again, another, oh my gosh, because of traceability standards, we'd stopped buying from the market, meaning they were moving exclusively to contracts with larger scale producers. Another manager explaining why they only have contracts with farms of 10 fidan or more. Well, working with small farmers is not easy. They're poor and always need money. The corporation does not provide money before the crops are delivered. So, so based partly on the apparent exclusion of smallholders from the corporate consumer market, international and multilateral institutions have been promoting since the mid-1990s contract farming between smallholders and corporate food suppliers, and this is just one example from the UN. Pro-poor contract farming attempts to address this exclusion through contract arrangements between smallholders and corporate retailers at home and abroad. So this is an example, this is one of the development agencies, a quotation. This is a typical representation of smallholders losing out on the gravy train of formal growth of agriculture and food. Cropping patterns in the static lands, meaning the lands that are dominated by smallholders, have been traditional crops. Really what these smallholders are doing is gardening, not farming. And as the IFID report on contract farming in Egypt explains the logic involved, many European importers have begun to exclude smallholders. However, if the smallholders are vertically integrated with exporters, many supermarkets will accept the participation of smallholders. So, although it is clear that there is an exclusion of smallholders from the direct consumer market, there are many ways in which smallholders are integrated informally, non-contractually into corporate food value chains. And in that way, the analytic of a formal agri-food industry becomes blurred. And I have like just a few minutes. So smallholders, for example, supply to agro-exporters on demand. This is all part of my research findings. Corporate processors buy from the market. That means from not outside of contracts. Smallholders supply to traders or middle-sized processors who then supply up the value chain. So I want a few minutes to give this example. Just one example of corporate dairy, and I can give more. Corporate dairy is a very important consumer product in Egypt. And it's one example of many in which the milk supply, well, for example, the milk supply per capita rose sharply in the 3 decades. Raw milk production, the milk supply, is dominated by smaller scale farms. And the dairy industry is heavily concentrated in the hands of a few corporations. So the dairy industry, like Johanna, they would say, we only have contracts with larger scale processors, but actually smallholders are integrated through these medium-sized processors. And this is an example of the value chain of raw milk for processing. So just in the very simple sense, a type of appropriation of value from smallholders, smallhold raw milk producers, but also there's much more of a story there in terms of the downward push on raw milk prices, in part because the industry imports milk substitutes from the EU and Australia and New Zealand. This is the largest food ingredient import into Egypt. And at the time of the revolution, there was a case, as some of you may remember, a case against the monopolistic practices within the industry. They were basically lowering the price. They were rigging, or what's the word? I'm sorry, I can't remember. Price fixing, yeah. Okay, so main conclusions methodologically, using the agri-food industry as an analytic, but then breaking it down. And there are direct and indirect past and present relations between rural livelihoods and corporate food. Thank you.
Thank you.
A methodology that comes out of research, field research that I conducted in Egypt from 2008 to 2012, based on my doctoral dissertation on what is titled "The Making of the Corporate Agri-Food System in Egypt," and I want to start off the main analytical framework is capital accumulation, and the
Thank you very much for this presentation. And صباح خير تاني. So let's go there to you, Marion. No? Yeah.
yeah.
So Marion Dixon, so please introduce yourself, and then 15 minutes, please, no more. Oh, sorry.
Okay. Thank you very much for coming to our panel. I'm very glad to be here. And I thank Martha and Karim for inviting me. It feels like I've been working on research in and about the region on agriculture and food for many years, and I have been kind of seeking a research group like this, so I'm very pleased with it. And I want to propose a methodology that comes out of my, you know what, actually I need a little bit of light to see my notes.